and welcome to episode 3 of the Curious Cutlets Podcast with me, Anshika and Sumit. Hope you're all keeping well and safe inside your homes. Before we begin today, I have a small story to share. As someone who works in corporate structure, we are often required to attend these trainings by our HR, right? So this one time at work, I ended up attending a training on Sexual Harassment of Women at Workplace Act 2030. Going in, honestly, I was sure I knew most of it, but stepping out, I was bewildered by not only how ill-informed I was, but only how few people knew of the details of the act. So today on the episode, we have a special guest, Ms. Susmita Sen, head HR of a global company that specializes in advising international clients on entering the Indian market and consulting them on quality HR standards. She's committed to transforming what she calls the human wear of the organizations, the people. Thank you, Ms. Sen, for joining us today this Sunday afternoon. It's so good to have you.
Thanks, Anshika. It's a pleasure to be here as well.
Okay, so to set the tone of this podcast for all our listeners, in our discussion today, we are trying to understand the practical challenges and applications of this act, in addition to a brief of what it constitutes. So therefore, it is not a lesson on the act, but also practical questions that revolve around it. So Ms. Sen, for someone who's hearing about Sexual Harassment of Women at Workplace Act for the very first time, what is the easiest way to explain to him or her what it means?
As we all know, currently there is a large influx of women in the mainstream workforce in India. So sexual harassment of workplace has assumed greater dimensions than we ever thought. Workplace sexual harassment is a form of gender discrimination which violates a woman's fundamental rights to equality, right to life, and the right to pursue her own profession, which is guaranteed under the Articles 14, 15, and 21, respectively, as per the Constitution of India. So workplace sexual harassment not only creates an insecure and hostile working environment for women, but it also impedes their ability to deliver in today's very competitive world. Apart from interfering with performance, it also adversely affects their social and economic growth and inflicts physical and emotional trauma many a times. So the POSH Act, the Prevention of Sexual Harassment for Women at Workplace Act 2013, focuses on creating and sustaining a safe, secure, and dignified work environment free from all such forms of harassment only for women.
That makes a lot of sense. So, as commonly perceived, is sexual harassment only or majorly against sexual advances?
Any form of harassment which creates a hostile working environment for a woman would qualify under the Act. Anything that would be towing the lines of self-respect and dignity of a woman would all qualify under the POSH Act. For simplicity of understanding, the forms of harassment have been differentiated largely in two categories. One is the quid pro quo, which says this for that, meaning any kind of tangible or intangible employment benefits. It could be pay, promotions, overseas projects, etc., that are traded in lieu of sexual advances. That's one form of harassment. The other form is, anything that causes a hostile work environment, which is an act or a series of actions that cause emotional duress due to unwelcome advances, sexual innuendos, offensive gender-related language, anything that is pervasive from, the perspective of attacking the dignity of a woman at the work. So, like I said again, so sexual harassment need not necessarily be sexual in nature. It is anything that toes in, impedes the dignity of women at the workplace would qualify under the Act.
Okay, makes sense. So according to you and your experience, what are the major misconceptions about the Act?
Anshika, I wouldn't really call it a misconception, but there is, in my experience of having had multiple sessions across corporate sectors, etc., large, small, medium-scale organizations, the one thing that I've noticed is that there is a complete lack of awareness on verbal and non-verbal forms of harassment. Women typically have an understanding of the sexual form of harassment, in literary terms, But
Hmm.
sexual harassment as per the Act has three different forms. They are qualified as verbal harassment, non-verbal harassment, and a third section, which is the sexual harassment. Now, the verbal harassment are, as the name indicates, that could be sexual jokes, innuendos requesting sexual favors, gender dictated remarks on clothing, looks, WhatsApp profiles, etc., etc. So, any of this kind of harassment would be verbal. And non-verbal would be all of it, starting from staring, glaring, stalking, sending lewd messages, or even in extreme cases, sharing pornographic notes or pics, etc. So these are, although there is no direct, again, a sexual abuse that's physical in nature, people do not understand this as also being qualifying under the Act. So that is one big thing which I've noticed, and I think there is a huge need to drive this awareness amongst both the women, both the genders, because from one gender perspective, it's important to understand where to stop, where is the line, and for the other, they need to understand, where is their dignity getting really negotiated in the workplace.
There were a lot of things when I took your session, Miss Sen, which I didn't know. And it's so important that people know about this, because I think knowing is half the battle won, right?
That's true. That's true.
True.
And
I
that's,
have a question.
yes, go ahead,
If you
Sumit.
don't mind.
No, go ahead, Sumit.
As you mentioned that this act was fairly recent. It was 2013 that this was, enacted. So, and I know you've had at least, I'm sure you've had at least about 10 or plus years of work experience in this. So, what was the case before that? What was it largely dismissed as not being important, or was there some other sort of legislation that looked after this?
No,
Because
so,
if this is the case that there was no framework for something like this before 2013, that's really alarming for us to know as a society.
Right. So Sumit, I'm not sure you've heard of the Vishaka guidelines, which were released by the Supreme Court in 1997. It was the Vishaka guidelines were basis.
I'm not aware. But
Okay.
I would love
so
to.
I'll just kind of very, very briefly walk you through what the Vishaka guidelines. So the Vishaka guidelines, it started with Bhavri Devi, who was an NGO, a Dalit social worker from Rajasthan, employed as part of the women's development project run by the government of Rajasthan. She was allegedly gang raped in 1992 by higher caste men who were angered by her efforts to prevent the child marriage of a 9-month-old baby. Her subsequent treatment by the police and court acquittal of the accused attracted widespread national and international media attention and became a landmark episode in India's women's rights movement. And the petition filed by NGO Vishaka, which she worked with, and 4 other organizations, in Rajasthan, against the state of Rajasthan and the Union of India, resulted in what we popularly now know as the Vishaka Guidelines, released in 1997. Yes. Now, from 1997 to 2013, gap of about 16 years. And why we already had the guidelines, why did it take for us to kind of really need the guidelines, is because while the guidelines, we all know in India, unless you have a framework in place, the enforcement in place, nobody follows advisories or guidelines, right?
Absolutely.
So that's predominant, and there were increasing cases of women hitting the glass ceiling, women experiencing all kinds of uncomfortable behavior and oppressive behavior in the workplaces, and having to make do with all of that while compromising with all of that because they needed the job as well. So these were the many episodes and incidents, and a lot of software organizations got into this, attracted a lot of worldwide media attention. Yes. We've heard of the Infosys cases, etc., way back in 2010. So, that kind of prompted the release of the Sexual Harassment Prevention, Prohibition and Redressal Act 2013. So that's the whole.
And just a quick Just a quick question.
Yeah.
So from that to the 2013, the current act we're under, is it largely the same, or has it become much more stronger, and has it become, broader in its, scope? Or is it basically just laid that down into acts what the Vishaka guidelines were?
Sumit, what it has done is it's largely the same. The guidelines largely remain the
Right.
same. What it has now done is it's become an
Enforceable.
it's become a statutory law as per the labor laws, because any organization that is 10 headcount or more needs to conform. So there are certain guidelines, so you have to set up an internal committee. That's the quasi-judicial body that will take care of the incidents in case anything happens within the organization. So there is a framework of in case something happens, how does the inquiry take place? There are timelines for the various procedures, processes. So all of this was laid down as advisories earlier. Now it's kind of a mandated script that organizations need to follow. And in case of non-compliance, there are penalties around it as well.
Ms. Sen, I have a very practical question, okay?
Yeah, go ahead.
Today, if I'm harassed at work, and in one of the other ways mentioned in the Act, as you mentioned, in order to save jobs, people do compromise. And, I might decide to keep quiet in that case.
Yeah.
So in those scenarios, how do we deal with this?
So Anshika, this is a very valid point, and this is again, so you can sense the climate of the organization and how and what's the clip between the cup and the lip, and I can make that out when I have these sessions in many of these organizations. In some of them, I find there are women asking many questions openly about their past experiences, about potential queries that might happen, or in something that they're experiencing, etc. In many others, and largely many others, I find there are no questions while the session is on. And at the end of the session, there's a herd of women around me who have multiple queries and want them addressed one-on-one. What does this really tell you? It only tells you that while there is an attempt to create that awareness, the organization, one, would not have been evolved enough, or it would not have communicated, sensitized its people enough to kind of evince the confidence amongst the women folk to allow them to trust the judiciary, the system within the organization, the internal committee, so to say. So there are cases. So I'm saying there are many cases where, despite an IC being there, women have difficult experiences, they are asked to stay back, or they're given a role change, etc. And these are realities that we are facing around us. But and that's the reason that the awareness sessions, the creation of the IC and understanding of what the IC role within the organization is so very important, so that they create a robust system within the organization with agile responses. They execute with fairness and transparency at all levels. And only when this is witnessed by the women folk can they be confident enough and feel empowered that that their voices are being heard. So unless that evolution really happens, it kicks in within the organization, it will continue to be a very muted feeling for large number of women who experience discomfort in the work. So through these sessions, our attempt is to get more and more people, the IC committees, the women, aware of their rights and how they should address these situations.
So, Ms. Sen, earlier in the conversation, you mentioned that there are tangible and intangible impacts on complainants when they go and report an act like this.
Mm-hmm.
Could you touch upon some of those instances? What really happens when we go and report something?
As per the Act, the tangible and intangible impacts on the complainant is very simple. The complaint is taken heed of by the IC member, whoever is the complaint is addressed to, and the IC would follow through on its due diligence to complete the inquiry on time and go through the witnesses, the records, and then arrive at a recommendation at the end of the case. Now, these are some of the logical, tangible, and intangible impacts. And while all of this, while the inquiry is in place, in case the complainant also feels a threat to her position or her being in the office, etc., the IC may excuse her from the workplace, allow work from home, make an allowance to, in case her role does not really allow for a work from home privilege, they might allow her to continue to operate from home with full salary till the inquiry is over. So these are some of the measures some organizations take, and these are the logical steps that I'm talking about. In many other organizations that are not evolved enough, or, again, there is a difference in the intent versus what they want to actually execute. There are, again, cases we've heard of where, the complainant has been sidelined. She's been removed from the project that she was undertaking. Some of them have been terminated from their services as well, etc. So it all depends on, what kind of awareness levels there are, what is the kind of, whether the organization really practices the nuances and the dictats of the law and the act in entirety, or is that being compromised on? All that. And therefore, the external member in the IC committee has a very, very strong role to play in all such organizations.
Great. So the question remains, Ms. Sen, that isn't sexual harassment subjective? What may seem wrong to me might just seem right to the person who's doing it to me, or someone else who's just being a bystander. Yeah. How do we view this?
So, Anshika, we know that, especially in India, and world over as well, by India, world over, we're people from, different countries, we follow different religions, we are a potboiler of, mixed culture, religion, rituals, belief systems, etc. And those are, deeply ingrained in each one of us, that has shaped our belief systems, our values, and, that is an inherent part of who we are. And therefore, there is a huge diversity. And what you're telling me is, what seems right to me may not seem right to somebody else. And therefore, these awareness sessions in organizations, it's not about right or wrong. It's in harassment cases, what we know is it's not important, or no importance is really given to what the respondent would have intended through his action, but it's how the woman whose complaint has received that action, that's meted out to her. So therefore, it's important to evaluate every action when and that's what we say, that you're in a workplace, don't be on your guard, evaluate your action before you do something, because it's not what you intend, but how the other person receives your action is what is important in, when a complaint goes out under this law, under the act.
Who should be my first point of contact at work, and what roles and responsibilities do they have?
So every organization, like I said, which are 10 member and above, needs to have an IC committee in place. And the IC committee typically is, like I said, is the quasi-judicial body of the organization. The constitution has senior lady in the organization. And it has a mix of, men and women folk as committee members who have some understanding of gender issues, have handled, similar cases in the past, or have a very deep understanding, or are from the legal background, etc. So it could be a mix of any of these for them as pre-qualifications for this role. The committee also needs to empanel an external member, a third-party member who could again be a social worker, an NGO, or somebody who's well-versed with the Act and its nuances in the corporates. That's how the IC is constituted. The first complaint needs to go out to any of the IC. So as part of the act, again, we say, one of the prerequisites is that you set up the IC committee, and the members of the IC committee, etc., and their email IDs, etc., need to be displayed in prominent places in the organization, so that anybody who has a query related or needs to make a complaint has this handy and knows who to reach out to. Having said that, any of the members of the IC committee can be, written to. You could address your complaint or your query to any of the members of the IC committee. However, if it's a complaint that you're making, it needs to go out within 90 days of any episode that you want to highlight that has caused the trauma or the discomfort to you. That's, again, diktat of the Act. For the key roles and responsibilities of the IC member are, like I said, the Act says prevention, prohibition, and redressal. So it starts with prevention and prohibition, which means sanitizing the workplace is priority one, through awareness sessions, through circulating of the policy, by ensuring all new joiners acknowledge an understanding of the written down policy that's shared with them, have understood it well, ensure there are regular meetings of the IC committees there, so that they do a sense check of the organization climate and the gender issues that could be brewing in different teams within the organization. And finally, if it's redressal, so conduct inquiries, investigations, and complaints pertaining to sexual harassment in a time-bound manner and in accordance with the law and the company policy, and fully, keeping in mind the norms of confidentiality and transparency and fairness. So largely, these are the responsibilities of the IC.
So you talked a little bit about the timeline. So we have to sort of get the complaint out of in this time duration of the act happening. So can you talk us a little bit through the entire timeline of how the process is continued after my complaint reaches the IT?
Right. So, like I said, this is a time-bound process. So, in case you face something unusual, uncomfortable, and you want to highlight it to the IC, you are free to write about it to any of the members of the IC committee or all of them. The choice is yours, and the letter, and this should be in written form, should go out within 90 days of the incident having happened. In case it's a series of incidents that have happened in the past, then from the last time it happened, within 90 days of that episode, you should be able to plug in your complaint. After the complaint reaches the IC committee, they would deliberate upon it amongst themselves, and within 7 days they would be able to respond to the respondent and ask for explanation on the complaint. The respondent, after receiving the copy of that complaint, would need to revert to the IC within 10 working days. This would be followed by a series of investigations with the complainant, with the victim, and the other witnesses, documents, etc., that needs to be provided. And this entire inquiry process needs to be completed within 90 days from your complaint having reached the IC. The inquiry report needs to be issued within 10 days from the date of completion of the inquiry, and this report needs to be tabled to the management or the board of the organization. And whatever is the recommendation that the IC has decided to mete out to the complainant and the victim, complainant and the respondent here, needs to be complied with. So the organization needs to ensure that all the IC's recommendations are followed through within 60 days of the report being tabled to the management. In some rare cases, either the complainant or the respondent may not be happy with the recommendations that the IC has made. in which case within 90 days of the report being shared, either the respondent or the complainant is free to file a police complaint and FIR in the court of law. And that needs to be within 90 days of the report having been tabled. This is now. Does this mean that the victim or the respondent cannot file an FIR beyond that? It doesn't mean that. It means that if it's filed within 90 days, then the IC does have a responsibility to represent themselves in the court of law if it's done within 90 days. Else, the IC can withhold itself from that, absolve itself from that responsibility.
Just the last question before we end. There are so many women around us who tend not to complain about various discomforts at work due to family or kids or other commitments. This process then in turn tends to continue, have ripple effects, and just embed in the system. How do we get those women to speak up? And in your opinion, why should they at all?
Okay, so I'll answer the second question first because that's simpler to answer. Why should they?
Yeah.
Is because they're the ones who are feeling the heat of it. They're the ones who are feeling tortured. They're the ones who are emotionally in turmoil because of what they are facing. And therefore, they are the custodians or the primary role holders to take a step in action here. Nobody else can do that better for them. So they need to take a step for themselves first. So that's the answer to why should they do it. The other bit, yes, there are many women who face this and they do it repeatedly over time. It becomes a second nature to face this silently and,
Right.
perhaps, make it a second nature for themselves, thinking that it will, if you ignore it, it will go away. It never does. It only grows and tantamounts till it really, reaches an inflection point somewhere. So therefore, a nip in the bud is absolutely important. How you can do it, and again, I come back to, why, again, the IC's role being so very important within organizations, to have open conversations, to have sensitization sessions, to have meetings for team members, for managers to kind of step up, be sensitive, and be aware of what is brewing within the teams, etc. So that, and whenever a case does take place, to take prompt action, to show how agile you are, and you really mean that it's a zero tolerance zone. Unless you really have these, strong mottos around you, and you have leaders walking the talk, and I see really executing itself with its responsibility. Unless these things happen at multiple levels and showcases itself, in a very robust manner, it's difficult to allow women to come out of their shell, because it's been years of being subjected, victimized, that they have faced, and therefore for them to feel confident and be heard, and their concerns being addressed in a fair and transparent manner, needs a lot of advocacy within the organizations, and only this will build their confidence, so that they're able to share and voice their concerns.
Great. So standing up for yourself is actually the first way to get through this.
That's
and with
right.
this, we come to the end of this episode. Thank you, Ms. Sen, for joining us. Sumit and
Thank you.
I are indeed very honored
Thank
to
you
have
so much.
you.
This was very insightful.
Not at all. It's been my pleasure, and you guys doing a wonderful job of these podcasts. I've been looking them up as well, listening to each of them. So continue the good work, and thanks for having me over today. I just hope you find all of this helpful, and it can really streamline something somewhere.
We did, and we hope
Definitely,
people
that's
who
the
listen to
perfect.
this find it very useful as well.
Thank you.